Rogues Gallery Online. Sex, drugs and period costume. Real historical figures behaving very badly. The following content is not suitable for anyone aged under 16 or adults who are very easily shocked or offended. If this is you, turn back now. Lovable rogues who remain, please like, share and subscribe. And if you could find it in your decadent hearts to support me on Patreon, I would be overcome with gratitude. Link is in the description below. Love School. Life skills and lust lessons with Ninon de l'Enclos. Paris, 1670. A school for love, at last. What young gentleman would not benefit from being skillfully coached in the arts of Venus, especially by the most celebrated courtesan in the whole of France? And what young lady would not wish to learn the mysteries of pleasing both her husband, if she chooses to have one, and herself in the boudoir? Ignorance, you know, is no excuse for boorish and selfish seduction, malodorous personal hygiene, or enduring ham-fisted lovemaking that brings one absolutely no pleasure at all. So says Madame Ninon de l'Enclos, a shining example of the triumph of vice when directed with intelligence and redeemed by a little virtue. She is one of the most learned and erudite women in Europe, a patron of Molière and a peer of Marguerite de la Sablière. Even His Majesty, King Louis XIV, is said to value her advice, often asking counsellors when contemplating some thorny issue of state, what would Ninon do? Yet she rejects the church, the traditional bonds of marriage, a woman's accepted place in society, and the moral values of her upbringing. In fact, your professeur d'amour is actually named Anne de l'Enclos. It was her father who first called her Ninon. He was Henri de l'Enclos, a shameless libertine and player of the lute who adopted an Epicurean approach to life. Now, if I may play the role of teacher here myself, Epicureanism derives its name from the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus, who maintained that pleasure is the most important thing in existence. Having seen the artistic prints which you keep under your bed, I can only assume that you feel the same way. Ninon's mother, however, could not have been more opposite. A pious and godly woman, she was devoted to the Catholic Church and followed the teachings of Christ religiously. How the profligate man and the righteous woman ever met, let alone married, is perhaps one of history's greatest unknowns. Ninon adored her father and eagerly absorbed his philosophy. He taught her how to ride a horse, sing, and of course play the lute, all the while encouraging her education in the strictly masculine subjects of history, science and philosophy. Henri thought it was hilarious when at 12 Ninon announced that she wanted to be a boy. He immediately went out and bought his daughter a pair of breeches, boots and a doublet, so she would be correctly attired the next time they rode along the Bois de Boulogne. Having a rule-breaking libertine for a father, however, did have its drawbacks, as her 12th summer was also the year Monsieur de l'Enclos was exiled from France for engaging in a duel over the favours of another man's wife. If Madame de l'Enclos saw this as an opportunity to instill in her daughter a powerful sense of propriety, social conformity and obedience to God, she was to be very sorely disappointed indeed. As she entered her teens, Ninon began to show a distinct lack of respect for the church. She used to smuggle philosophical writings into services hidden within the pages of her prayer book. While all around her were saying Mass, she was being inspired by the words of Michel de Montaigne. They say she once brought an entire service to a standstill by loudly bursting into an obscene song while the priest was delivering his Easter sermon. If her mother hadn't thought her damned for that, she certainly did when Ninon told the priest, who was understandably furious, that all religions were nothing but inventions. Ninon had made her decision about which direction she wanted her life to take. She wanted to be able to pursue whatever physical and intellectual stimulation she chose, and live as a woman of independent means, unencumbered by the commitment of marriage. As you can imagine, this decision did not meet with much approval from anyone. Her mother, who was by now at her wits' end, begged Ninon to, at the very least, consider a respectable union with a gentleman of quality. Gentlemen of quality, however, will only marry a virgin, so Ninon put herself beyond any inconvenient proposals by allowing herself to be seduced by one of Paris's most notorious young rakes, the Comte de Coligny. Having essentially ruined herself, Ninon was now unmarriable, which was exactly what she wanted. Exiled from the world of polite society, Ninon declared that since men had 1,000 privileges that women do not enjoy, she would henceforth live her life as a man. Not by dressing up in a waistcoat and picking fights with everybody, but by doing whatever she pleased, without consideration of what was proper or acceptable. Ninon immediately set her sights on becoming a successful courtesan. In her opinion, this was an ideal way to make lots of money while remaining in total control of her life. Not even 20, she used her wit and intelligence to gain entry to the exclusive salon of the popular and well-connected Marion de Lhomme. You might think a courtesan such as Madame de Lhomme would be far from welcoming to a young upstart encroaching on her territory, but this was not the case. De Lhomme felt no threat to her position by allowing Ninon to interact with her circle of wealthy and influential admirers, because, to all intents and purposes, Ninon was not that much to look at. She certainly wasn't beautiful. Neither, however, was she ugly. Ninon had a long nose, heavy eyebrows, and a fleshy chin. No different, really, to any girl that you might see working in a shop or working in the fields. She did not, however, subscribe to the common opinion that the only way a woman can succeed is if her appearance pleases men. Ninon used her mind to intrigue and captivate de Lhomme's clientele, and she soon eclipsed her host, who had nothing to offer but fading beauty. I have spoken to many men who knew her during this time, and all were spellbound by her conversation, wit, and breadth of knowledge. The Grand Conde himself found swapping witty Latin repartee with her far more stimulating than simply gazing at her décolletage, although they obviously became lovers too. Others were enchanted by her singing, and of course her lute playing. She danced and laughed uproariously, unlike her more restrained contemporaries. At one of her now infamous parties, a guest was in such high spirits that he threw a chicken bone out of the window which hit a passing priest on the head. Ninon, of course, was doubled over with laughter. When she was once told of a government minister who had made his mistress a noblewoman, she joked that it was very much like when the Emperor Caligula made his horse a consul, which had the room in hysterics. But it was not just her wit that made her attractive. Ninon was as well educated as any man, and conversed with them as equals, challenging and presenting her own opinions. She also had the gift of knowing exactly what to say to make anyone feel at ease. The received wisdom among both men of sport and men of intelligence was that if you passed up the opportunity to spend the night with Ninon on account of her looks, you were doing yourself a major disservice. This isn't to say that Ninon wasn't extraordinarily skilled in the boudoir. She could make a man blow his load as well as she could conjugate Latin verbs. Also, unlike many women of the present day, she washed herself with soap and water before engaging in any kind of lovemaking, even applying a subtle lemon scent to her private areas. The bed, she maintained, is a battlefield, where victories are only won at great cost. She divided her lovers into three categories: the payers, who offered money and gifts for her favours; the martyrs, who she slept with because she felt the experience would benefit them; and the favoured, whom she enjoyed for her own pleasure. Ninon was unashamed about taking pleasure and enjoyment. She once wrote of her early life, "If anyone had proposed a life of chastity to me, well, I should have hanged myself." She caused a scandal by swimming in the nude and openly talked about how much she enjoyed sex. One female friend of hers was left speechless when Ninon asked her to recommend a spicy bedmate. Not content to wait until men came to pay court to her, Ninon would take a chair along the Cours Lorraine and proposition any man who took her fancy, passing him a love note emblazoned with her address. Not that any lovers could become complacent once they had won her favours. Ninon had a strict rule, only to enjoy them for 3 months at the most. Any longer, and she felt that either she'd become bored or they would start becoming too demanding. This often left a procession of baffled and heartbroken seigneurs weeping at the door of her apartments. Yet, even after she had so callously dismissed them from her bed, such was Ninon's charm that very few stayed angry with her for long. She encouraged all of her former beaux to continue visiting her as a familiar friend. Such was their desire to bathe in the glow of her company that former lovers would willingly swallow their wounded pride and sit with her alongside the gentlemen, or men, who had replaced them in her affections. To those who suggest that this welcoming and cordial approach to her fellow man is almost Christian, I would point out that many men of God regularly visited Ninon. For the conversation, obviously. One of them was Cardinal Richelieu, who offered her 50,000 crowns of God's money for one night in her bed. Ninon accepted his generous and pious offer, but instead of sleeping with the cardinal herself, she sent in her place the aging Madame de Lhomme. What the good cardinal thought of this, we do not know, but it's doubtful that he got his money back. By 1652, Ninon was the toast of the fashionable and the scourge of the respectable. Even she, however, was not immune to the spectre of monogamy. Louis de Mornay, the Marquis de Villerceau, had no intellectual, cultural or artistic prowess. In fact, he was a hunting-obsessed, compulsive womanizer with his brains in his breeches. He was also a devilishly handsome, slim-hipped wolf, and Ninon, much to her surprise, found herself overwhelmed with lust. De Villeso's legendary libido was similarly inflamed, and the two ran away together to live in his country estate, where they copulated like rabbits in summertime. When they weren't having sex, however, they had absolutely nothing at all to talk about. So de Villeso went off on lengthy hunting expeditions, while Ninon employed a resident scholar with whom she could be intellectually stimulated. This arrangement worked for 3 years. The two had a son, Louis, whom she dotes upon, but ultimately Ninon grew dissatisfied and returned to Paris. Her rejected paramour was inconsolable and took rooms opposite Ninon's apartments in an attempt to woo her back. When he saw lights flickering in her bedroom window, he suspected that she was entertaining another man, which she probably was, and fell into a fever. His plight touched Ninon's heart, and while she had no intention of returning to his embrace, she did try and aid his recovery by cutting off much of her hair and giving it to him in an envelope. This had little effect on de Villeso's mood, but her subsequent appearance around town, sporting her newly shortened hair, did start a fashion for ladies to adopt a bobbed hairstyle known as cheveux à la Ninon. This also had little effect on de Villeso's mood, but ultimately he accepted Ninon's decision and the two remained friends. It did not take Ninon long to re-establish herself with the more artistic, intellectual and Epicurean members of Parisian society who flocked to her salon. She also returned to her more promiscuous ways, taking pleasure wherever she chose. When one impertinent lover demanded that she sign a contract stating that she would remain faithful while he was away on business, she readily put pen to paper. Once his carriage had pulled away into the countryside, however, she was lustily enjoying the attentions of a score of lovers, laughing about that little guarantee that I signed. How dare they try and tell her what to do? When she wasn't hosting or conducting affairs d'amour, Ninon gave lectures on sex and sexuality, shocking those for whom public discussion of these subjects by anyone, let alone a woman, was beyond unacceptable. One of those shocked was the king's mother, Anne of Austria, who in 1656, only a year after she had returned to Paris, tried to have Ninon imprisoned. Some say this was because the Queen Mother was taking a moral stand against Ninon's libertine ways and the corrupting influence they were having on a nation's youth. Others suggested that she was jealous because her own soirees were being ignored in favour of Ninon's, leaving her standing forlornly by the fireplace holding a plate of sandwiches. There were also some who felt that by seducing all the most powerful men in France, Ninon was wielding the kind of influence that could one day prove to be dangerous. Whatever the reason, the Queen Mother ordered that Ninon take herself to a convent where she would remain until such time as she had repented of her godless ways. Generously, she allowed Ninon to choose the convent inside which she would be confined. Ninon made her incandescent with fury by saying that she wanted instead to be sent to a monastery called the Grand Cordelier. This institution not only forbade women from joining, but its male inhabitants had a somewhat debauched reputation for what they got up to with various non-male guests when they weren't busy praying. It would have suited Ninon down to the ground. In response to this shocking snub of royal consideration, Queen Anne ordered that Ninon be confined at the convent of the Madelenettes. This, of course, is well known as a place that law courts, and sometimes even their own families, send girls who are considered especially wayward. It did not suit Ninon at all. As she sat behind its walls, she secretly began work on a satirical pamphlet entitled La Coquette Vengée, The Flirt Avenged, which had the temerity to suggest that it was possible for women to live a totally happy and fulfilling life without the influence of any religion. Outside the walls, many of her beaux and supporters stood en masse and loudly called for her release. These calls were ignored until Ninon was visited by Christina, the former Queen of Sweden. A friend of René Descartes, she had long been intrigued by Ninon's philosophy, and when they finally met in person, Christina, like everybody else, was bowled over by her agile mind and engaging personality. She wrote to Cardinal Mazarin, who in those days was second only to the king in terms of power. Whatever she said in her letters must have moved the cardinal, because he immediately overturned the Queen Mother's ruling, and Ninon was allowed to go free. Before she left, Ninon concealed her religion-baiting manuscript in her underwear, so she could smuggle it past the nuns on the door. They were hardly going to look for it in there, unlike the monks. It was eventually published 3 years later. As she entered middle age, while her appetites for life and love seemed undiminished, Ninon has all but retired from the life of a courtesan. She prefers instead to devote her energies to the patronising of art and philosophy. Her soirees have become sober affairs where she's banned all alcohol and boorish behaviour. Ninon herself now abstains from wine. Card playing is also banned and conversation is measured, the chicken leg throwing days of the past now long gone. She still adheres to her Epicurean principles, but within a framework of moderation, restraint and honour. They call her the beautiful keeper of the casket, because when entrusted with items of great value by one of her female friends, she refrained from selling them, even when, after many years, it seemed as though her friend would never return to claim them. When she finally did return for her box of valuables, Ninon gave it back untouched. France's intellectual elite flocked to her like bees around a honeypot. The artist Nicolas Mignard, composer Jean-Baptiste Lully, the playwright Jean Racine and the poet Paul Scarron are all regular visitors. She has a particularly strong relationship with Jean-Baptiste Poquelin, better known of course as Molière, France's greatest living writer. There's a rumour that he asks for her opinion regarding all of his plays before he shows them to anybody else. His famous work, Tartuffe, about outwardly pious people who are actually lecherous, greedy and deceitful, was given its first reading in Ninon's presence. I'm sure she approved of the subject matter. When the finished play received strong criticism from those who felt that it satirised the church, well, it did. Ninon supported it with her usual passion and erudition. The play could very well have been banned in France were it not for her. Ninon also welcomes female artists into her company, unlike many such salons which are solely for the benefit of men. Authors such as Marguerite de Sablière and Henriette de Coligny freely swap ideas with their male counterparts in an atmosphere of stimulation and inclusion. There's nowhere like her salons in all of France, perhaps even the world. But what good is knowledge and experience if one cannot share it? Ninon de L'Enclos Academy for Young Gentlemen opened a few years ago and has proved an enormous success. Students, who are of course male, have to pay a considerable fee for the benefits of her instruction. Young ladies, however, who cannot be classed as students on account of their gender, are given her advice for free, in a private capacity. Her curriculum includes the care and handling of a wife or mistress, the correct approach to wooing, and how to end an affair. She's not above giving practical demonstrations of her techniques when verbal instructions are not sufficient. Many consider her teachings to be immoral and blasphemous, but if they bring happiness, pleasure, and equanimity to men and women, where's the harm? Ninon teaches that men should treat women as equals, with consideration and respect, as they themselves demand to be treated. For men, she says that love should not be about conquest, but about understanding and connection. Talk to your woman continuously about herself, and seldom about yourself, she instructs, which some men may find particularly challenging. She maintains that love and lust is a primal physical instinct, like anger or fear, that obeys no reason. And to fully appreciate it, one must first experience it, whether you're a man or a woman. Young men and women should enjoy all the delights of love that are presented to them, learning and growing from their experience. A woman who has loved but one man will never know love, she says, and the same is true for a man. Neither sex should wait until marriage to begin their journey, for what is the point in denying oneself pleasure and experience? It's all very well to keep food for another day, she says, but pleasure should be taken as it comes. This is a maxim that I think we should all strive to follow, whether we're young or old. So learn whatever lessons Madame de L'Enclos has to teach you, sweet Madeleine. Live your life as you please, and don't be tyrannised by men or set upon by women. The future Ninon represents is exciting, and I believe just around the corner. Imagine a world of reason, where all can live in equality without shame or judgment. By the end of the 18th century, I'm sure such a world will exist, and the name of Ninon de L'Enclos will be revered as one of its prophets. All it'll take is a little education.